Thank you everyone for joining us on the cloud native.fm podcast. And today we are talking about how to transitioning from a totally different background into the DevOps engineering or the cloud stuff. So today I am joined by Sid Palas, and we were talking about all these kind of stuff today. So thank you very much, Sid, for joining me today. Tell us about yourself and tell us about what you're currently working on these days.
Sure. And your audio is coming through a little bit slow. Maybe if people can put in the chat whether or not they can hear us okay. I
Yes.
believe you said introduce myself and tell us what I'm working on. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. So my name is Sid. I am a software engineer who focuses on DevOps and cloud infrastructure. And as I am implied, I started my career in a different field entirely. So both of my degrees are in mechanical engineering. And then I started out my career as a mechanical engineer and slowly transitioned towards software and then found my niche within software, kind of the thing that I was enjoying the most and found the most interesting was kind of building out these systems in the cloud and focusing on how we can make teams more efficient in doing so. And so that's what I've been doing for the past few years, really enjoying that and working with lots of different startups as they build their first application platforms, usually with Kubernetes. And it's been a blast. Yeah. So happy to be here and excited to chat more about this topic.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think that topic is right now is everybody is focusing on, like people are really moving from. I see every day there are some stories around it, that people are jumping from a completely different background and then jumping into DevOps and the cloud native role. And it's been a wonderful, like it's been a uh, every day we heard about these stories, and I'm really glad today that you join us and you have that kind of like the background of keep completely moving in a different way. So so let's talk about from your experience first, and then we drive the conversation forward, and we hope to capture more question as well. So tell us about how you able to at what moment of time you realize that now you can jump to the completely different role, the DevOps or the IT or the cloud native or the cloud role, and you have a wonderful YouTube channel, the DevOps Directive, and you have done wonderful videos, tutorials on that. So tell us about how when you did first started about thinking about why not I move to the cloud and DevOps role.
Sure. I think there wasn't really a single moment in time per se. It was more so a gradual transition. And I think that's the key for anyone who wants to transition from one job function to another, whether that's in tech or anywhere else. Figuring out how their current role or what portion of their current role is relevant to the place where they want to go. And so in this case, I was working as a mechanical engineer, but much of my role had software elements to it. So I was working on control systems for things like satellites. And so we were building out simulations and testing how those control systems would interact with the physical systems that we were building. And so while it was a mechanical engineering role, there was certainly a heavy software component to it. And I found that I was enjoying those pieces the most. And so I essentially, within that same job, I didn't even change jobs. I just started volunteering for more and more tasks that were software based. And so doing that allowed me to shift in kind of a continuous fashion rather than needing to one day I'm a mechanical engineer and then the next day I'm a software engineer. And so I really tried to chart a path that allowed me to, it's almost like a zero downtime migration, right? Like I didn't want to quit my job and then look for a job for 6 months and then find a new job in the cloud. Instead, I took my existing job and figured out how to slowly morph it over time into the place where I wanted to be, and that was software engineering. And then once I was working as a software engineer, I found that DevOps and cloud was the particular niche that just resonated most with me. And so I think thinking about it as that smooth transition versus needing to be a specific, okay, I was that and now I'm this, is the right way for people to approach a career change like that, if possible.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think many of the people who might be watching us or might be listening to us, they really have some different kind of role today. They're working on might be the mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or kind of a completely different setup. But right now, every day we have spent a lot of times on every day doing some of the things on the internet, on the some of the things on the software side. We have been heavily investing a lot of our time. Either we are this business of the IT, or either we are not in that part. We're heavily doing that, and people kind of feel engaging with that technologies, and they think, how do we actually make part of that ecosystem? How do we able to make some innovative solution on top of that role? So I think that's really the charisma or insight passion that they had. They haven't, that's been a part of their previously, like at the childhood, but they realize as moving forward into it. So tell us about like people who right now into the, let's say, electrical engineering or the mechanical engineering. A lot of my friends currently are doing these kind of stuff. So what are the best path if they figure out that this is actually their more interesting space is? What are the things you recommend to those people? What should they do in order to transition to this DevOps or even in the IT world?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sort of, I think as you hinted at, the first step is deciding what you want to do with your career. And so there are plenty of people who are perfectly happy and content uh, in other engineering disciplines, in other niches. And so, really taking a look at what motivates you and figuring out what type of career path would be most relevant for that motivation and that excitement is sort of step zero before you even start to transition to a new job function, a new title, etc. Figuring out that you want to go there is kind of a prerequisite. I think once you've done that, identifying how you can almost test the waters before you make the jump, meaning are there things that you can do that within your current job or part time on the side as a side hobby or side project where you can get a feel for what it really means to be to work in that space that you're excited about and sort of validate whether or not your initial assessment was correct. And so if step zero is figuring out you want to go there, step one is figuring out sort of confirming that or validating that assumption with some as close to real world experience as possible. That may be, like I said, a side project, that may be a freelancing gig helping a company in that capacity, but sort of getting some experience to know whether or not it is as exciting as you thought it was going to be. And then I think the next step, if you confirm, if sort of both of those checks pass, you think you're excited about this as a field, you validate that, and now you decide, okay, I am enjoying this quite a bit and want to make this more full time. That's the point where you can start to chart a path towards making that more complete transition. And that's sort of the point where in my journey, I stayed within the company I was at. I was at a company called Lockheed Martin at the time. I was doing the control systems work that I was describing, but I knew I had validated the fact that I did want to move more towards software engineering. And so within that company, I volunteered or applied to a different job. And so I made the transition internally to a different project. I still basically had the same title, but it was a new project. And in that new project, there was a lot of more opportunity for me to, let's say, go from 20% software engineering up to 50% software engineering. And so that was another sort of step along that journey that enabled me to make that transition. And by doing so within the company I was at, I think it was much easier to make that jump because I was a known quantity and people knew the level of work that I would produce and were willing to give me a chance in a new field because they had seen seen the quality of output in other projects in the past.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think a lot of the software industry's work is then you have a completely and like you are the mechanical engineering right now, and you want to do in the IT stuff, that I think the transition is looks really simple and easy, because in the moving stages, like if you have work on these projects that require mechanical engineering skills and then do part of the IT team, it's a win-win situation for the IT company, because you have the knowledge of that mechanical engineering thing that they are building on, and also have the IT equipment, the IT skills that you are looking at. I think that's a really a fun thing. Like people who have some electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer, or might be some lawyers or some doctors, they can transition to this new role, but they have these other skills that IT people doesn't know about that, and you bring that knowledge into the team, and that's actually a wonderful things. And I see a lot of the successful stories in there, like people jump to that transition because you bring these knowledge, that the skills gap that the team have, you fulfill the skills gap, and it's actually a win-win situation for a lot of the folks. And today I think the 2020, with the corona and with the COVID, everybody is isolated in their room and do nothing and just typing in the computer, and you have enough time to figure out what actually you can do. Because in the previously you could do a lot of the traveling, 10 to 12 hour of, let's say, you in the when you go home, and you have not enough time to explore other things. But when you have this paradigm of 2020, when the COVID hit, I see a lot of the decisioning happening in that time. Like people is completely moved to the different, and they have a very successful stories in it. And and also I think the sharing the knowledge that you are learning is also the really important factor into it. As you have your own YouTube channel, other people have then these kind of stuff. So how you tell us to the people that who are learning some kind of a new technology, why the sharing part of the learning is really important in these days, and what do you get from it? Like this is the question people ask every day. If I share knowledge, if I can share something, what should I get from this by sharing the knowledge?
Yeah, I think there's one point I want to touch on before I answer that question that you talked about, and that is leveraging your domain expertise from a previous role to give you a differentiator in a new role. And so, like you were saying, I came from mechanical engineering, but then once I moved more into software, I still had that deep experience of working with operations teams and physical the manufacturing of physical goods that I was able to map onto new operational processes in the software world. And so I think that's a very valuable thing to set yourself apart as a candidate coming into a new field by maybe going into a company that, yes, you might be taking on a software IT role, but they still have a need for that expertise from your previous role. And I think that's a key thing to call out that you touched on that I wanted to highlight. And then your other question around why it is valuable for people to share their learning journey and talk about what they're learning and help teach others what they're learning. I think for me, one, I just really enjoy the teaching aspect and find that very fulfilling to help others pick up these new skills and level up their DevOps and cloud infrastructure skills. But I think another piece is that it really forces you to understand the topic much more deeply. So in order to be able to explain it simply without losing the essence and distill a concept into its most basic form and explain it at the level that matches or meets the level that your audience needs it at, because everyone's at a different point in their journey, in how much base knowledge they have. And so understanding who the target audience is and being able to map a concept into the framework that they currently have available to them, that exercise, I think, helps to solidify the understanding, your own understanding along the way. So in order for me to be able to say, okay, who am I talking to and what do they know about that is relevant to what I'm trying to explain? And therefore, choosing the right language and the right level of detail and the right presentation of a particular topic really helps me to check and validate my understanding and make sure that there were no details that I had sort of glossed over in my head that need to be filled in. And so I think that's the main value of teaching others along your process. Of course, there's going to be people who know more than you. That shouldn't stop you from helping others to level up to where you are.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's in the 2022 is as by learning and validating your knowledge is right now is currently a very important thing to have. You when you share something and people make some comments on it and you learn from it, that other people's have say look at the same problem in a different way, the same solution in a really different way, and that's really the differentiator between doing something in really alone and doing something sharing in something kind of a public as well. And also I get this question a lot previously, like people have some kind of roles in it in their company, and right now is every company is an IT company, or not every, might be most of the companies are IT companies, and whatever your domain or whatever your company that you're currently working on, this puts some stuff on the IT company as well. So if some of the mechanical engineers at that point of the team, that they have some IT team and they have the mechanical engineering team, and somebody realized that now my focusing or my passion, my hidden gem is actually more relevant to the IT or the DevOps or these kind of role, I like these role. So what are the ways for that people to come transition to that, to team into completely different role set, and how should they convey messaging to their boss, and now I am interested in this thing, whether you allow me to do this kind of stuff, or if they have some 9 to 10 hour of shift, what should they do to learn other things that they really that they really have interested on.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sort of how to position yourself and position this change such that your management team is willing to go along with it, right? How do we make sure that it is not just a selfish thing of I want to make this switch and therefore you should let me do it, but I want to make this switch and here is the business value that it will add um, to the company. And I think if you can articulate those two things, then it makes the decision for your managers or their managers much easier, because now they're no longer saying, oh, we want to just help this individual achieve their goals, but if it also is achieving the goals of the company, it's a no-brainer. They would be not smart to reject that, because then you're just going to go elsewhere. And so I think how we can frame it in such a way that it is adding business value is important. And the way that I would think about it is, as we touched on earlier, what you're trying to do is highlight sort of your superpower within the team. And so if you can talk about how as you move into this new role, maybe there's processes in your previous role that you will now be able to automate and streamline, right? So if previously you were having to go through and let's say you were a mechanical designer and you're using SolidWorks or CATIA or any of the modeling software to build out components. And you're doing that over and over. And so you're building a special linkage one day and you're building a cam the next. And a lot of that is very manual. Maybe by moving into this new role, you're able to articulate how you would take some of those pieces that you were previously doing manually, and maybe there's a whole team of mechanical engineers doing that manually, and streamline the process through software and automation such that now each of those team members that you were previously working with are X% more efficient or can eliminate Y steps from their workflow that they previously had to do each time. And so really thinking about how this move, how you can leverage your previous expertise of how your previous position worked and apply that knowledge in a software capacity or an IT capacity to streamline and automate. I think that is the story that you'll want to tell and can make it very clear that, hey, even though I may not be the expert in software yet, I can leverage my expertise from my previous position to make to make everyone's lives easier and faster and impact the profit margins of the business by doing so.
It's absolutely, absolutely, and I think on top of that other question, like that is really a relevant question in that conversation is that because I think in a company itself, like right now, when you look at the companies, there is most investment, like most of the energy they're spending on is building the IT infrastructures. That is more companies is heavily dependent on. So what you should tell to the companies or the hiring manager or the bosses, how should you develop the culture where people can work hard to make this transition from different teams, and if they find that they have the skills and they can promote their employees into get the roles that they think that is actually work on. So how this culture is eventually developed within the companies, so making people allow them to transition to the different role in a very easily and very smooth process.
I think one thing that really helped me in the company I was at the time is that it was very normal for individual engineers to support multiple projects or multiple programs at once. So almost always, engineers on the team would be supporting one to, let's say, three different projects at any given time. And so because of that, there were natural breakpoints where, let's say, I had been supporting two projects, one of them wrapped up. Now I need to go find another project to support. Uh, that process is happening with some regularity. Let's say every 6 months to a year, maybe you're either adapting one of the projects you're supporting or finding a new project that you're going to work on. And so those were very natural points where, in evaluating what set of projects I wanted to move to next, I was able to have a point in time that enabled me to do that exploration and have talks with future managers, potential managers running those other programs, and understand, hey, what would this role look like? And would I potentially be a good fit for it? So I think that is one thing that can help, of like the continual adaptation of your role. If it's already happening, then you can use that to your advantage to adapt and uh, make that transition at a cadence that already makes sense. I think if that doesn't exist, then having it a cultural element where you are able to have some percentage of time for not necessarily like Google's 20% time, but just like that it is acceptable to spend some amount of time experimenting and trying innovative ways to approach your current role. And so that could mean building, let's say, writing a little script to automate some aspect of your job, or um, or building out a new interface that would replace a slow, inefficient one that currently exists. And so I think having that culture that allows you to experiment is really key in enabling that sort of smooth transition from one field or role into another.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And Walid is on the chat and he's telling about either like building IT infra or using the cloud services or cloud infrastructure. So I think that's the question. And also he's telling us about the you can continually evaluate the position that the people are working on. I think that's really important and that's a good question actually. So what your recommendation was, because you want to understand how this actually person is affecting the business myself. So what do you think, what are the criteria for evaluating the success of the employee or the people who are working on some projects?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And to answer Walid's question of building IT infra or using cloud infra and services, I think both. I've seen instances where a small script has saved hours and hours of time. And so that's like the very micro example where you have this team that maybe is not super tech savvy, and they are able to automate some element of their current process away, So I've seen sort of that at the micro end, and then at the macro end, right? You have enterprises deploying cloud infra at scale, and so I think either of those can be relevant. I think it's just key to know where along that spectrum makes sense for the particular use case and uh, the software maturity of your team, right? Like someone who is new to software is not going to be capable of designing and rolling out a large scale infrastructure. And so figuring out sort of where along that journey the team is and whether or not you can add business value at the level of software complexity that they can achieve and manage is important. So I think, yeah, figuring that out is pretty important. And then I think there was another element to your question that I'm forgetting.
And then the question was like, if you want to evaluate the people, the stuff they're working on, and those people who are really transitioning to the different role. It is really difficult to understand what my evaluations are, and either team, what are the do you think how they can learn what how the company is evaluating me now before previously in my previous role, and what do you think what are the evaluation criteria for people who those are transitioning from different role into the IT or the DevOps side?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think eventually all business metrics boil down to uh, dollars of revenue and dollars of cost, right? So there's many layers between what any individual does on a day-to-day basis, or there can be many layers between what an individual does on a day-to-day basis and that eventual bottom line calculation. But really understanding that path of like my action now, how does that impact either the top level revenue, how many dollars are coming in, or the costs going out? How do my actions impact that? And so being able to articulate clearly how a project, any project, impacts those two things. So on the one side, it could be I wrote this script that automated this process and it saves 2 hours a day for 4 engineers, and they were doing that every day. And so here's the calculation of how much money I'm saving. Um, on the other side, it could be, oh, I did this analysis that we can now better assess how to target our ads on Facebook or whatever. And so that is making our targeting more efficient, and therefore we can get more customers per dollar of advertising spend. And so that is changing both sides of the equation, right? It's changing the cost because it's how much we're spending, but it's also changing the revenue because we're getting more customers per dollar out. And so just knowing how to tell that story and tie your actions as close to you can to an actual dollar amount that I mean, this is really what it all boils down to. If you can tell that story and it is true, then there's no reason for anyone to deny your path. It can be very hard to do that sometimes, but I think framing it that way of how does me taking on this project impact the business, and then backing out and figuring out how to approach it, that's really the best way to go about it, I'd say.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think on top of another good question, like I think it's been like when you look at this in 2022, this is technology is a huge shift. Like every day we have heard about term that we never ever heard about before. Like we talk about containers every day. We talk about orchestration, Kubernetes. We talk about serverless. We talk about so many other things that haven't existed before. And people, those who are transitioning into this world, would that be important for them to understand what's happened previously? What is before the container, how container came into being, how the orchestration came into being, and also the companies who are looking at who are making people life easier, they can transition into it, how they look at this perspective, the technology shifts, the terminologies shift, and the focus of learning curve and the learning shift as well. So I think it's boiled down to the two question. One, for the people who those are transitioning, how they can look at this space like container and Kubernetes space, and also the companies, how they understand, because most of the companies is don't understand, the leaders and the management don't understand the new technology in itself and don't realize what the use cases for those technologies are.
Yeah, I'll address the first question first. I think I have said it before and I'll say it again. When people ask how they should go learn about containers, uh, or any technology, I think I really like to focus on the fundamentals. And your point about understanding where we came from and the motivation for why these things exist is very important. Is a very important foundation for someone to have. And so, for example, if you want to learn about containers, I think going through the process of deploying a web application without a container makes a lot of sense. So maybe you uh, spin up a VPS on some cloud provider, go SSH into it, install your favorite database, configure some firewall rules, install a web server, throw some some HTTP, or sorry, some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files in there, um, and see the level of effort it takes to set up and configure from scratch all the pieces to a modern web stack. I think going through that process can be daunting at first, but I think it helps to motivate why it is a challenge to have dependencies of different versions for different pieces of your technology stack, and the fact that, oh, this piece of software required that version of this dependency, and this other piece of software that I'm trying to run requires a different version, and now how do I manage that? And so also things like health checks, and is my application running? Do I need to take action to get it back to a healthy state? Like, seeing the challenge of what you would have to do to achieve all of these things before we think about containers, before we think about Kubernetes, helps to understand the motivation behind why these tools came to be in the first place. And so I think that's a very valuable foundation for people to have, and to learn and then apply those knowledge to eventually learning some of these more modern tools and really understanding why they exist and the problem that they're trying to solve, rather than just seeing them as this magical tool that someone invented and this is how we do it, so this is what I'm going to learn. So I think that is a super powerful way to start learning about some of these new tools, by actually seeing what came before and using that experience to figure out the motivation behind the newer tools. The second one was helping companies to understand the newer tools and why they should be using them, and whether it makes sense to migrate from whatever they're currently doing to one of these other systems. And once again, I think mapping that migration, the value add of this new system, onto profit and or costs is pretty much the way that you want to go. So if you have a system and it's working, you can look at, there's a few things that you'll want to consider, right? There's one, the level of effort to migrate from whatever you're currently doing to this other thing. So maybe you're currently deploying to VMs, and now you're thinking, oh, does it make sense for me to containerize and deploy to Kubernetes? There's some cost of doing that. So trying to evaluate the cost of doing that is one piece. Then there's evaluating the value that you would get. And that value can come in a few different verticals, right? There's value potentially if now you can bin pack more efficiently and put more of your processes into fewer cloud compute resources. Maybe the AWS bill or the GCP bill will drop if you can do that. So that's kind of a cost savings. There's also maybe a change in maintenance cost of, right now there's X operation engineers who are on call and dealing with problems, and they spend 5 hours a week dealing with toil of checking things and restarting things and fixing alerts and what have you. And maybe you expect some of those to change or go away. They They might go down, they might go up, depending how you do in building out your new infrastructure. Um, but yeah, so that's another cost area. So there's sort of the cost to transition. So that's a one-time fixed cost, hopefully. There's cost of operations. There's cost of the actual compute resources. Maybe goes up or down based on the changes. And then I think there's another factor of like being able to hire talent with the proper skill set for the new tech stack versus the old tech stack. And that is a little bit less tangible. It's a little bit harder to boil that down into direct revenue or profit or loss or costs. But I think it is still relevant here. And so I think framing the evaluation of a new technology in that mindset of what am I gaining in terms of functionality or cost savings? What am I losing? What is it costing me? Both in this initial transition as well as ongoing, and using that to have a well-informed decision about whether or not you want to make that transition is the right way to go about it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think during the when the cloud native or the CNCF landscape came into being, we've seen a lot of the hiring challenges for the companies. And there's so many stories of how what should do, what is now the best criteria to find the talented people and find the skillful people that their passion is about learning and implementing new technology. And we're all living in the open source framework, and that is the next question from me. Like, if you want to transition to the any into that role, I think the bootstrapper is actually contributing to the open source world. First, you tell us about the audience how the open source works today right now, and why it is so vital to contribute to the open source technologies, and why you should event like attend event like KubeCon or these tech conferences around the world. So tell us about their pain, some points on why should people who are transitioning to this world start contributing to the open source technologies right now we have.
Open source technologies are powering such a huge percentage of the web, right? Just that's just a fact that we can start with. That also means that these are large, mature code bases with sometimes active, very active teams. There are obviously open source projects that have less active teams, but you can find relevant projects that are rapidly evolving and have plenty of open issues that need addressing, and often very welcoming communities who can help individuals as they are ramping up their skills to learn what it means to operate in a large code base, interact with team members, make sure code quality is high, and follow the guidelines and the protocols that a project enforces, all while having a public record that you can point to for future, on your resume for future job applications, to say, oh, I have contributed to this project that you have probably heard of. And so if you have multiple commits into, let's say, Kubernetes core or some other main project that people have heard of, that's a very impressive thing to hiring managers who are thinking about, oh, does this person have what it takes to operate within our code base? I can go and look at their interactions with team members. Are they positive? Are they technically sound? Are they contributing in a meaningful way to these open source projects? And use that as a proxy for, I think they will be able to operate within my team, building out whatever software this company is building out.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's really like, I think today in this world, like we're living in the 2020, and if you want to transition to this new IT role, the open source is actually a wonderful place. Like, you spend a lot of time, 9 to 10 hours on your day job, and then you have some free time, just fun exploring the open source landscape. and then you find the most passionate area where you can influence more on, and then you come file a ticket or file a issue, or you can commit yours, uh, send some commits that you think that need to be improved on. So that is a really a good piece. Now you are the part of the community, the part of the ecosystem, and that brings you some kind of role, the hardcore role that you're looking forward to implement those changes. So I think it's never it's really not existed, or it's been shadow away in the previous, but right now with the landscape like CNCF or the Continuous Delivery Foundation landscape, it's give you the leverage to make this transition even more possible. That is actually really, really difficult. Like people are thinking it, I think last decade of how do we able to be IT engineers? What should this require us? But right now we have so many places, we can so many YouTube channels, we have so many good guidelines, we have so many foundations, open source tools. So I think this is a healthy and wealthy community, so you can start exploring on. And also before we let you go, and we try to hit this point on, like there are so many YouTube channels and there are so many good resources, but one of the your courses is really, I really appreciated the Terraform courses on your YouTube channel, the DevOps directive. And tell us about like people who are running the YouTube channels or who are posting some media. What should do you recommend to those people? How to make this activity a more successful activity? What should they do on?
YouTube is a funny place. The it always surprises me what takes off and what does not. So that Terraform course I released about a month ago has done very well. Tons of people have taken it and seemingly from the comments enjoyed it and learned quite a bit from it. So that's very exciting. I think understanding your motivation for wanting to produce videos or whatever type of content you want to create, and ideally having that motivation be not coupled to the number of views that it gets is very important. I think for the first 8 months of my YouTube channel, I started it in the beginning of 2020. I think it took me 8 months before I had 600 subscribers or something. So there were many videos. They're still on my channel. They're terrible. You can go look at them. The lighting's bad. I kind of talk with a monotone and stare at the camera. But I wasn't doing it necessarily to get a bunch of views. I was doing it to, as we talked about earlier, sort of solidify my understanding of these topics and teach them to others to help them along in their journey. And so because I was sure getting views is exciting and seeing subscribers is exciting, and I did get a little bit obsessed with refreshing the studio page to see those stats, the only way I was able to keep going for 8 months, when I would put out a video and it would get 10 views, 20 views, etc., was because there was sort of this broader motivation of putting it out, hoping to see the impact that it had on others. And so even a video that only has a few hundred views might have a comment that says, this helped me solve my problem, or this helped me in this interview and helped me land this job. And so those interactions with the audience early on are very important. Were very important motivators for me. And I think really the key is to think about it as a process where with each new video or each new article or whatever your preferred form of media is, you are improving the quality. And so that could mean there's quality along a number of dimensions, right? There's production quality, where now I have these special YouTuber lights and I have a fancy camera, so I look crisp, and that's fine. And sort of it certainly doesn't hurt to have those things. But more important, I think, is quality along the educational aspect and the entertainment aspect of how you deliver this content to keep viewers' attention and deliver the information in the most effective way possible. And so I think continuously evolving along those different dimensions with each coming week or month is really the key to achieving success. I guess the other key is just to not give up. So if you post 10 videos and stop, of course, you're not going to succeed. So sort of continually getting better and better, and continuing, period, are kind of the two, I think, pieces of the equation.
Yes, absolutely. And Belize is also sharing the comment is your content is top quality and a hard work. So it's really thumbs up to your content. Like some of the stuff I'm really like about it is Terraform course, so wonderful. It's great learning resource. So I think it's really important. Like as you mentioned, like I'm running the YouTube channel for a very long time, not enough subscriber, not enough views, but I do it some consistently, like because it's really praises me. Like I talking to wonderful people like you in the past as well. And it's helping me to be a more public speaker, more. I learn every day by doing some live stream and these kind of activities. So I think it's kind of a, you have to be a very consistent in that path. Otherwise, you're not able to do any good things with it. So I think it has to be consistent, and you have a good calendar or roadmap ahead what you want to do and what you want to do. So for my I'm ready to give up. So podcast is a really ideal situation for me. I talk to people, learn new technologies and these kind of stuff. So I think it's really the focusing on not just on the numbers on these kind of things, how many people you help with. It just if just a one people who can help you, I think it's motivated you to do more and more stuff with it and more these kind of activities. So final question from my side, it's what you currently roadmap, what you're currently working on. Following you on the Twitter, and always you share some good things in it. So I recommend people to following you in this Twitter, and definitely subscribe to the DevOps Directive YouTube channel. It's have wonderful resources for the people who are transitioning to the DevOps world. So tell us, our audience, what is you currently more focusing on these days?
I am doing a few things. One, I've been consulting for startups for the past 2 years, mostly seed stage to Series B, kind of building out their first application platforms. And throughout that journey, I've learned a lot. I've helped a number of companies, but I've also felt that many of these companies are building some version of the same thing. And by that I mean they have their core business, that's their secret sauce, that's what they're focused on, and that's their application. But then they have this whole set of tooling around it, oftentimes includes things like Kubernetes. Maybe they're using Helm or Customize. Maybe they're using Circle CI or GitHub Actions or GitLab, whatever CI/CD tool. They've sort of made this DevOps system around their application, and it feels like everyone's building some very similar variant of this. Maybe they chose different tools, but they fit them all together. And what I haven't seen is somebody take that concept and do it in an open source fashion. So I'm actually, starting in April, going to be focused on what I'm calling the Kubernetes platform playbook. And so it's going to be a open source opinionated implementation of a application platform built on top of Kubernetes, in which I evaluate all the different options within that CNCF landscape, where I'll essentially imagine that I'm the CTO or the lead infrastructure engineer at a company, and then go through that decision tree of, oh, should I deploy onto AWS or GCP? Do I want to go with a managed cluster, or do I want to manage it myself? What solution do I want to use for CI/CD? How do I want to package and deploy my applications, et cetera, right? There's this whole decision tree. Do I want to use GitOps and something like Argo CD or Flux to apply my applications versus pushing them from my CI/CD pipeline? So there's just all these choices that people have to make. And so my plan is to do an evaluation of those and sort of document, here are the trade-offs. Why would I choose this over that? Which tools fit best together? And come up with my sort of best attempt at this moment in time of what this would look like if I were actually making these choices, and do all of that in public with lots of live streams, written content, open source repo, such that in the end I'll have this sort of best practices guide for, if you are going to, maybe you're migrating off of Heroku or off of some platform as a service, or maybe you're building something greenfield for the first time. What what would you do? And you can use this as a starting point to see how all the pieces fit together and what a working implementation would look like.
That's super cool. Like I think is right now most of the startup is facing these kind of issues. Like I
Yeah.
think if not everyone, but most of the startup, because when you look at the CNCF landscape, there is so many tiles in it. There is so many like criteria. It's a service mesh, the policy engine, the Kubernetes controllers, the orchestrations, the container runtime, the networking, the storage. There is so many stuff into it. And for the people, what is you think is, which one to choose and which one you not choose? That actually is a question around the cloud native maturity model. Like what other things work best together, and what should I choose on what scenarios? So I think it's really missing, and if you're working on, that's really a wonderful news for me, because I'm working on my YouTube channel for the short videos, and that's I'm currently focusing on how should I convey this information to people. If you have this situation, you should adopt this solution over this, and that is actually missing piece in it, and that's really wonderful. And Walid has one question, and then we can go about what do you think? What would you think would be the right thing for these startup to get back on track and focusing on core values and offering? I hear Kubernetes, GitOps, CI/CD. Should they really worry about details? Can they go serverless, stack first, manage services first instead of battling which tools and which tech? So I think it's really this question we are talking about. So it's really missing piece. Like, what you suggest to this question? Like, what should people do? Like, if you have not much information about it.
Yeah, as always, the answer to most questions in software engineering is it depends. But I think the way to think about the problem is to think about this spectrum of flexibility and control versus the amount of customization that you're able to achieve. And so at one end of the spectrum, we have fully managed platform as a service, maybe something like Heroku or its competitors. Also, things like serverless fits into that a bit, where you are no longer needing to deal with managing the servers at all. I think there's a little bit of a challenge with serverless specifically in that now we've shifted some of the complexity from the management of the servers to the interconnect between all these individual lambdas, etc. But we'll ignore that for now. But so at one end of the spectrum, we have fully managed. You get kind of a magical experience, but you have to fit within the box that they give you. So you have to follow the specific set of constraints that they are levying onto you in order to achieve success. And that is likely sufficient for many teams when they're initially getting started. All the way at the other end of the spectrum, we have, so if we go far enough, we've got bare metal compute in a data center that you're controlling yourself. But let's roll that back a couple steps so that we end up at like VMs in EC2 or Compute Engine or whatever, and you're managing those yourself and doing everything with them directly. There's a whole thing in between where maybe we're offloading some of our workloads onto managed services, like we're offloading our databases into RDS or Cloud SQL, but not everything into managed services. And then there's also things like managed Kubernetes somewhere in the middle where you are no longer managing the underlying compute nodes necessarily, but you are offloading the management of the actual control plane to the cloud service provider. And so I think figuring out where along that spectrum you fall, and I think starting out with a managed offering is a great idea. So you can really iterate quickly on adding business value and building out your core application. And then eventually you may reach a point where either the bill starts to grow very quickly because they're charging a premium for that, or you have something about your workloads that no longer fit in the box. Maybe they're specialized for long-running web services, and now you have these batch processing workloads that don't really fit the shape of the offering. So if either of those things happen, like the bill is just becoming outrageous, or you no longer can satisfy your business requirements, given the constraints that are placed upon you, that's when you need to think about moving down that spectrum. Down that spectrum from giving up a little bit of that magical automated experience and taking back some of that control so that you can customize the system to fit your needs. So that's how I would think about it. Sort of, here's the spectrum. On one side, we give up a lot of control, but we get some nice automation out of the box. And then the other side, we have full control, but there's a lot more configuration and figuring out how different things fit together. And so figuring out where we want to be on that spectrum and what aligns with the current size of our team, the current needs of our business requirements, and sort of where we want to go or where we plan to go in the near future is how I would make that decision.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in the software industry, it's really a problem from day one. Like if you use the managed services, you lose the configuration. And if you go to the right to build something up, and it takes time, money, investment, and all these kind of stuff. So I think it's really the conversation about where should you fall into, and you either into the place where you are into the customization or rather the managed services. So I think, but it's good to see like people is investing the time on these things, like on managing this maturity model, because that's is really people is not talking about previously, because it's nobody able to find that like if you talk about if you use this thing or this thing, you lose some of the folks who are working on your friends, then it's really quite of a challenging. But it's good to know from me like people are working on this maturity model, and it's really a wonderful piece because it's some missing information, and what is when it's landed there, I think it's helped a lot of the startup and a lot of the folks. So thank you very much, Sid Palas. It's really wonderful time talking to you, and I highly encourage the people who are watching us or listening to us, go follow this DevOps Directive YouTube channel. It's been a wonderful resource, wonderful courses on Terraform and other wonderful cloud native and DevOps technologies. Great place, a great learning experience for everyone who want to get involved into it. And before I let you go, final thoughts on SIDS, and then we wrap up the session.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Siam. It was a great discussion. Glad we had some good commentary from the audience. And yeah, make sure to subscribe to Siam as well.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you very much for joining me today. We hope to cover other things on the cloud native space as well in the future as well. So thank you very much for joining the session today on the Cloud Native FM podcast. Hope to see you again in the future on another guest with another episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay enjoying your life. Bye bye, everyone.